Okay, good morning, everyone. Welcome to week 3 of CS 206. Um, so hopefully most of you managed to submit assignment 2 last night, and you're moving on now to assignment 3. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the assignments and again where we are and where we're going with the assignments. So we're working with the physics engine PyBullet. And you've been extending this piece of code, simulate.py, which tells PyBullet what exists in the virtual world and how to simulate it. You spent a little bit of time at the beginning generating a world for your robot to inhabit. And PyroSim simplifies the description of the links or the objects that make up that world. Your file spits out this standard description format or simulation description format world.sdf, which is read in by Simulate, passed along to PyBullet. And PyBullet wraps around Bullet and uses the Bullet physics engine written in C++ to simulate links. So we talked about last week. F equals ma, force equals mass times acceleration. If you rearrange that equation into acceleration equals mass divided by acceleration, you can compute the forces, or Bullet computes the forces that are acting on the links. Like, for example, gravity, which is a force pushing downward, that will update the acceleration and thus the position of the object, which in the case of gravity is to update the position downward of a link if it is somewhere above the ground. Okay. Then you started to modify generate.py, so it's now creating the universal robot description format file body.urdf, which also contained links. And then if you just finished up assignment 2, you've been adding joints which connect links together, and they restrict the relative motion and or orientation of links. How do they restrict the relative motion or orientation of links? Joints do so in Bullet by applying forces to keep the objects from, in the case of revolute joints or rotational joints, it uses a force to keep them from moving apart. So if other forces are acting on those links that are trying to pull or push them apart, the joint will apply forces to keep them having the same relative position, but they are free to change their orientation. So all the movement you see in a simulation is being caused by Bullet, which is applying various forces to those objects. Okay. In assignment 3, you're going to be adding in sensors, and sensors, as we saw in the Bratenberg vehicles, those sensors are going to register values. They can be values from out there in the world, and we'll look at some of those later, like light sensors. This week, you're going to be incorporating touch sensors into your robot, which, as the name implies, record whether a given link that includes that touch sensor is touching the ground or another link. You'll notice, you can sort of see in the grayed out area here that we're eventually going to close this loop where information from the sensors is going to flow through the robot's brain to its motors, and then those motors are going to control the joints and cause this robot to actively start moving, but we're not quite there yet. So your robot is going to be passively moved around, usually by you clicking and dragging that robot, and as you do, at the end of assignment 3, you're going to be able to see how this robot is rudimentarily able to sense what's happening to it. Okay. Just a couple things I wanted to point out here in the wiki instructions is that we're going to be you're going to be including 2 new Python libraries this week. NumPy, which is short for numerical pi. How many of you have used NumPy before? Just go ahead and type yes into chat or put up your hand, that's fine. I want to give a rough sense of how many people. Okay, most of you have worked with numerical pi before. That's great. For those of you that haven't worked on numerical pi before, as always, my advice is start in on assignment 3 early, so you can take some time and familiarize yourself with NumPy. There's hundreds or thousands of tutorials you can find online about NumPy. So just make sure you take the time this week to familiarize yourself with NumPy. For those of you that haven't worked on it for a while, same deal. Okay. After you've, let's see, let me go back to the top here. After you've added the sensor, printed values to the terminal or the command prompt so you can see the values arriving at those sensors, you're going to be storing them in a NumPy vector. So we're going to be capturing them in a vector, saving them out to a file. And then you're going to be visualizing how those sensor values change over time by creating a plot using matplotlib. So that's the second Python library we're going to be using this week. How many of you have worked with matplotlib before? Okay, great. So again, most of you, but maybe not all of you. Same deal, take some time to learn matplotlib and familiarize yourself with it. We're going to be making extensive use of NumPy and matplotlib as we continue on with the assignments. Okay, any questions about assignment 1, 2? Everything's going okay? So far, so good? Okay. All right, so back to our lecture material. We're halfway through this second module of the course, the tools of the trade, where we're sort of getting into the nuts and bolts of how physical, and in our case, simulated robots work. We were talking about artificial neural networks last time. Some of you may be familiar with deep learning and neural networks already, but as you probably already figured out, we need to make a few changes when we're adapting neural networks to control robots. So, artificial neural networks, we started with Bradenberg vehicles last time, 2 sensors, 2 wires, and 2 motors. We threw away the body. We committed Cartesian sin here, but don't worry, we'll bring back the body soon enough. And the 2 sensors become our 2 input neurons. The 2 motors in the Bradenberg vehicle have become our 2 output neurons. And the 2 wires have become the synapses which connect neurons together. So we can represent any neural network as a graph, where a graph is made up of a series of nodes and edges. The nodes are meant to represent neurons, and the edges are meant to represent synaptic connections between those neurons. We can wire up our neural network however we like. We can assign weights of influence to our synapses. These are usually negative and positive floating point values. If you set the weight of influence of a synapse to 0, that means by definition that the presynaptic neuron, meaning if we are sitting at a particular synapse, it's the one before the synapse. That means that the whatever the value is of the presynaptic neuron times a weight of 0 means it's going to have no influence on the postsynaptic neuron. Okay, so I'm going to talk about pre and postsynaptic neurons as we move forward. Just remember that that means the one before and the one at the base of the arrow representing the synapse, postsynaptic neuron, the neuron that sits at the head of the edge or the target of the synapse. Okay, so we looked at this very basic computation, which is how to compute the value of a neuron. We take the value of the presynaptic neuron, multiply it by the synapse, plus any other presynaptic neurons that are arriving at that neuron. We take that presynaptic neuron's value, multiply it by that synapse weights, and add it. So we basically compute a weighted sum at each neuron. And we then pass that weighted sum through sigma, which represents some kind of activation function, some way of squashing the value back to a desired range for our neurons, which in the cartoon example here is 0 and 1. This basic calculation, computing a weighted sum and then squashing it by an activation function, this is the foundational calculation in all neural networks, all deep learning. Any app that runs on your phone that's doing autocorrect or recognizing images in faces and is doing so using a neural network, this is what it's doing at the lowermost level. Okay, we ended last time by exploring how neural networks can be constructed to compute functions, where we can supply values at the input layer, which are meant to be arguments to the function. We compute or we propagate the values through the networks by computing these weighted sums and applying an activation function, and the value that arrives at the output is meant to be the result of that function. We saw last time how changing, setting different values for weights and setting different threshold values for an activation function can create different functions. We saw how setting the weights to 0.5 and the threshold to 0.8, if we assume that the input values are binary values, this will compute the AND function. We saw how we can take the same architecture meaning the number of nodes, the number of edges, and the way those edges are wired up. We can take the same 3-node, 2-edge network architecture and assign different values, 0.5 at the weights again, but having a different value for our threshold. That computes the OR function. We saw last time how in order to compute a slightly more complex function, XOR, we cannot, this 3-node, 2-edge architecture is no longer sufficient. We need to include an additional detail of neural networks, which is a hidden layer. We're putting this intermediate layer between the input layer and the output layer. We don't have time to go into the theory or proofs for why this is true in this course, so you'll have to take my word for it that a neural network that lacks a hidden layer cannot compute a non-linear function. Without a hidden layer, can compute linear functions, and and OR are linear functions, binary linear functions. If we want to compute a nonlinear function, of which XOR is one, we need to include intermediate or hidden layers. Okay, so I left you last time with the homework to think about what would be the values of these 6 weights, these 6 synapses, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We also need to apply a threshold value for each of our 3 neurons. Different neurons in a neural network can have different activation functions or different threshold values for the same threshold activation function. It's hard to look at this and immediately decide what these 6 weights should be and these 3 threshold values. So an easier way to think about this, to divide and conquer, is to think about these 2 hidden neurons as computing 2 subfunctions, which means you need to think of what the weights are to compute those 2 subfunctions. So what should those 2 subfunctions be? And then how do we want to combine the results of those 2 subfunctions to compute our final function, which is exclusive OR? Does anybody think they came up with an idea? I see Shauna and Robert still have their hands up. That might be from before. What are the 2 subfunctions that we probably want to compute at the hidden neurons? And it's okay if you don't quite know what the weight should be for those subfunctions yet. Matt says they should be the AND and the OR subfunctions. Exactly. What brought you to that conclusion, Matt?
I'll just unmute. I feel like it's easier than me typing it
Absolutely. Go for it.
So if OR is true and is not true, the function XOR will be true. And if OR is true and is true, the subfunction XOR will not be true. And if OR is not true and is not true, XOR is not true.
Exactly.
So you can use those subfunctions to see what XOR is.
Exactly. Thank you very much, Matt. So if you just look at the output values here for the XOR function, you'll notice that they share a lot in common with the OR function. So as Matt mentioned, we can test to see whether OR is true, so we can compute the result of OR. And it doesn't matter which of these 2 hidden neurons we do it in. Let's assume that we compute OR over here. In 3 out of the 4 cases, that's the correct answer. We should just let that value flow through to set the output layer. But in one case, we can see here XOR and OR differs, which is the last case, when both inputs are 1. And as Matt mentioned, that's the case where AND is true. So I'll go back to AND for a moment. You can see only then is AND. So what we're going to do, our strategy is going to be in 3 out of the 4 cases, we're going to let the value of the first hidden neuron flow through to the output. And in the 4th case, we're going to compute AND over here. AND is going to flow down and suppress or inhibit. It's going to inhibit the expression of the OR function. We don't want this one to light up as a 1, which is what OR is going to try and do. We're going to suppress it. Okay. So let's have a look. There are different settings that will allow you to do this, but we're going to just borrow what we did before. We've got 0.5 and 0.5 flowing into our OR function here. And if we set a threshold of 0.4, as we saw before, that means that this neuron will compute the OR function. We want to compute the AND function over here. So we can go back a slide and see that in order to construct the AND function, we're going to set the weight of this synapse to 0.5, the weight of this, the weight of this synapse to 0.5, and set a higher threshold to 0.8. So this neuron will only light up with 1 when both of the inputs is 1. That's AND. This one over here, this neuron will light up with 1 when either or both of the inputs is 1. Okay. As I mentioned, in 3 out of the 4 cases, we want the value here to show up down here. So we're going to set a value of 1. This is kind of, you can think of weight of 1 as like the identity function. So whatever is here, we're going to multiply by 1 down here, and we're setting a relatively low threshold. So when this is 0, 0 times 0.1 is 0, and that is less than 0.5, so that's good. Whenever this is 1, 1 times 1 is 1. 1 is greater than the threshold of 0.5, so we get a 1 down here. So if we just look at 1, 2, 3 of the 6 synapses, you can convince yourself how the value of OR will always flow down into this neuron, which will be great for 3 out of the 4 cases, but not for the 4th case. So how do we get the AND function to suppress or inhibit the expression of a 1 in that 4th case? We use a negative weight. This is an inhibitory synapse, as we talked about last time. There are actually, in the human brain, there are many more inhibitory synapses than excitatory synapses, which is an interesting finding in neuroscience, and there's still a lot of work to do to explain why that's the case. But we can see in this simple case why it's useful. If this is the AND function, we know that this neuron is only going to light up when both inputs are 1. The rest of the time, this neuron is going to be 0, which means 0 times minus 1 means inhibition fails. There's no inhibition because this neuron is off. It's set to 0 in 3 out of 4 cases because it's the AND function. In the one case, when it lights up as a 1, 1 times minus 1 is minus 1. And in this 4th case, when both, actually, let me skip ahead here. When both of the inputs are 1, this lights up with a 1, and this lights up with a 1. In both OR and AND, when both inputs are 1, the output is 1. So we have 1 here and 1 here. 1 times 1 plus 1 times minus 1 is minus 1. So the 1 and the minus 1 cancel each other out. This hidden neuron has successfully inhibited the value flowing from the first hidden neuron. 1 plus minus 1 is 0. 0 is less than 0.5. And we get a 0 placed into the 4th entry. It's often hard to listen to somebody verbally describe a neural network and understand how all that works. So you can see here that you can actually do this by pen and paper. For those of you that are mathematically inclined, this could be kind of fun. You can just sort of write this down with pencil and write in the values and erase them and work your way through all 4 cases and convince yourself that that's actually what happens. Okay, that is a lot of effort that we have just expended on a very, very simple function. And even in that simple function, it's just at the limit of our intuition of being able to construct a neural network to do so. What happens if we have a more complicated function? So we have 2 inputs and 2 outputs, or 3 inputs and 7 outputs, or 1,000,000 inputs and a couple dozen outputs. As you can probably imagine by now, it's not difficult. It's not difficult. It doesn't take very long to get to a particular set of data where it is impossible for a human to intuit how to write down the weights and activation thresholds for that function. So back in the 1980s, an algorithm known as the backpropagation of error was introduced, and this was a way of automatically altering the weights of the synapses to produce the function that we want. Backpropagation was proposed in the 1980s. It worked well for simple neural networks or shallow neural networks, but once you started to add 1 layer in between, or 2 layers in between, or 10 layers in between, so that you had a deep network, it has many intermediate layers. Backpropagation didn't seem to work very well. So in the 1980s, the backpropagation algorithm kind of ran out of gas and sort of took us into the second AI winter. It took about 30 years to figure out how to do backpropagation of error well in deep networks, which was resolved in about the mid-2000s and brought on the current AI high summer that we're all enjoying. Backpropagation in itself is a fascinating algorithm, and it's rather intuitive, so I'm just going to give you the intuition for how this works. Let's assume that we have a big truth table like this. I haven't filled in all the values, doesn't really matter for our purposes. We'll take 1 row in this truth table where when input 1 is 0 and input 2 is 1, we would like the 2 output neurons to have the values 1 and 0. We don't know what the weights should be, so let's start by just setting all the weights to 1. If we take 0 and 1 and we plug these into the input layer and we propagate it through, 0 times 1 plus 1 times 1 is 1. 0 times 1 plus 1 times 1 is 1. We're not going to worry about the activation thresholds for now. We'll just assume that they're not here for now. So we have 1 and 1 at the output layer, but we wanted 1 and 0. So if we put what we wanted down here, we can see that for the first neuron, there is 0 error. The first neuron is doing what it's supposed to be doing. But the second neuron, there is an error of 1. It is not doing what it is supposed to do. So we can take that error and propagate it backwards. We're now going to flow from the output neuron, this output neuron, we're going to go back along its synapses to its presynaptic neurons, this one and this one. And along the way, we're going to alter the weights to make this error go to 0. So I'll just go back and forth. You can actually see there's a way to actually compute the difference of these synapses as a function of what the error is. We're not going to go into the details of backpropagation, but I think you basically get the idea. In backpropagation, there's kind of 3 steps. Forward propagation, plug in your values, go down to the output layer. The error calculation, figure out where the errors are occurring. That's step 2. Step 3, for those neurons in which there is error, go backwards and fix things along the way to fix that particular piece of error. Okay. The intuition here is that at each step we're making localized changes to the synaptic weights. We're only making changes to these 2 neurons, these 2 synapses. We did not make changes to these 2 neurons, because these two synapses are arriving at a neuron that's doing what it's supposed to be doing. So if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Yeah? Okay. So it works nicely because it's localized change. We're making small changes in just the places where there are problems. So this is like using tweezers on a neural network, making slight fixes. And if you repeat this process enough, you can gradually sculpt these synaptic weights to give you exactly what you want at every row. That's backpropagation. Okay. Sounds nice in theory, but there are some problems here, and these are problems that are still being wrestled with today. Let's expand our hypothetical truth table here to a more realistic situation. Let's imagine we have a database from the hospital where every row in the database corresponds to a given patient who's passed through the hospital. And every column represents whether or not, yes or no, they were exhibiting a particular symptom. We'll assume that this particular set of patients were subjected to a test that could tell whether they were suffering from K different symptoms. A doctor, an expert, came through and diagnosed whether or not the patient was suffering from a given disease or not. You'll notice that these are still all binary values. So in theory, we should be able to construct a neural network that, given a particular patient, will predict will output whether or not that patient is suffering from a disease or not. Why would we want to do so? Well, the hope is that if patient N+1 arrives at the hospital, we apply the test and we get back the K binary variables representing whether or not they're exhibiting the K symptoms. We should be able to take those K binary values, input them to our trained neural network, and the value arriving at the output is the neural network's prediction of whether that patient is suffering from the disease or not, without requiring an observation by the human doctor. As you can imagine, our goal is to make this neural network accurate so that it can actually do this correctly without human supervision. Turns out that this doesn't always work, and one of the main reasons is because neural networks often overfit the training data that they're supplied with. So let's see a cartoon example of how this works. Let's imagine that this neural network has n hidden neurons, 1 to n. Imagine that we applied backpropagation in the way that I just described, so that the backpropagation is determining what all the weights in this network are. And you can see that I'm not actually showing you the weights. Let's imagine they've already been set by backpropagation. The neural network can cheat on this problem by learning not the function from symptoms to disease, but learning a different function, which is to recognize each individual patient and memorize whether or not they had the disease. So in the case of patient 1, you can see the patient 1 actually did suffer from this disease according to the doctor. So these weights might be set so that hidden neuron 1 lights up whenever patient 1's set of symptoms are supplied. And the value arriving at that hidden neuron is whether the patient suffered from that disease or not. And that value is just passed along to the output layer. And the output layer is going to light up with 1 or yes, if this weight is set appropriately. So the network does well there. If we supply the symptoms for patient 2, which are 0, 0, 1, 0, 0, 1, if we apply them there, patient 2 lights up, and then that flows through to the output layer. And the weight is set so that whatever patient 2 suffered from, that's what lights up in the output layer here. So in essence, backpropagation can train this neural network to recognize. So the ith hidden neuron will light up with 1 if it recognizes that this is patient I. And the weight of the synapse going from the ith hidden neuron to the output layer, that weight is set so that the value arriving at the output layer will be whether or not the patient suffers from that disease or not. So instead of learning this function, the neural network is learning to recognize these different patients and encode their disease outcome in the synapses. This is not unlike all of us, which maybe some of us have done this in the past. You failed to study for a test, and the night before the test, instead of studying all the material, you get a copy of the same exam that was given last year, and you memorize all the examples. And you remember all of the examples, and if the professor gives the same exam this year as they did last year, you're in luck. You can pass the exam, and it gives the impression that you absorbed the material, but you didn't. You memorized the material instead. A neural network can do the same thing. Hopefully all of you can see that. The problem with cheating, of course, for us students as well as for neural networks is, again, if the n+1th patient comes in, this thing only recognizes the first n patients. It doesn't recognize the n+1th patient. So there's no way of knowing what the neural network will do in that case, and it's probably unlikely to give a correct diagnosis. Okay. One final detail of neural networks that we're going to talk about that will be relevant for robotics later in this course are recurrent connections. So all the connections or all the synapses we've seen so far, they're pointing downward. They're going from the input layer to the hidden layer, or from the hidden layer to the output layer. We can add horizontal connections like you see here, or even self-connections. You can have an arrow that leaves a neuron and curves back and connects to the same neuron. That synapse has the same, its pre and post synaptic neuron is the same neuron. What are recurrent connections good for? Well, they add memory to a neural network. They allow it to remember things. You can actually go back and work through some of the simpler examples we looked at, and since there are no recurrent connections here, there is no way for the neural network to remember what happened the last time we supplied values to the input. Every time it's starting fresh. Let's have a look at these. Recurrent connections here. Let's assume that this neural network is sitting inside a robot that has 2 sensors and 2 motors. We'll stick with binary values for now, just to keep things simple. Imagine we want to compute the value arriving at the motor 1 neuron. You can see that there are 3 synapses in red arriving at this neuron. Imagine that at this particular point in time, the robot is registering a value of 1 on its left sensor, sensor 1, and it's registering a value of 0 on its right sensor, or sensor 2. So far so good. We take 1 times whatever the weight is here, 0 times whatever the weight is here, and we now need to take the value from motor 2, but we've only just started to forward propagate the values. We have the values at the input layer, but we have not yet computed the values at the output or the motor layer. So we've just started that process. We're computing the value at motor 1, but we need to reference a value at motor 2, but we haven't computed the current value of motor 2 yet. So we take the last value of motor 2. So assuming that in this robot's lifetime, it's at the second or a later time step in its lifetime, it's computed these values previously, we can use those previous values. So to compute the value of motor 1, we're going to take the current value of sensor 1, current value of sensor 2, and the previous value of motor 2. 1 times this, plus 0 times this, plus 1, assuming 1 was the previous value at this motor, times this synaptic weight, and we sum the weighted sum there and squash it by an activation function. If we're computing the value of motor 1 for the very first time, in which there is no previous value for motor 2, we use a value of 0. Okay. So you can see now that however motor 1 is going to behave, its behavior is a function of what it currently senses at sensor 1 and sensor 2. And it's also a function of its previous internal state, which is being stored in the values at motor 1 motor 2. So we've introduced a little bit of memory to the neural network. So far, so good? Any questions? Okay. Let's come back to backpropagation for a moment. We've got 2 input neurons, 2 output neurons. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 synapses. 2 of them are recurrent. Imagine we are trying to use the backpropagation algorithm to set the weights of these 6 synapses. I'm only showing the values of the first 4. I'm not showing you the values of the other 2. Like before, we supply 0 and 1 to the output, to the input layer, and we want this neural network to produce 1 and 0 at the output, but it doesn't. It outputs 1 and 1 instead. There's no error here at the first neuron, so we do not have to backpropagate the error along these arrows. But there is an error at this neuron, 1, so we're going to have to travel back along all of the synapses that are arriving at this neuron, which are these ones, 1, 2, 3. So we go back along these synapses, 1, 2, 3, and we change the weights of these 3 synapses according to the error. But in backpropagation, if you're not at the input layer, you keep going. You backpropagate further, because if we think about the value arriving here, it is not just a function of this neuron times this weight, and this neuron times this weight, and this neuron times this weight, because this neuron is also being influenced. The value at this neuron, which is influencing our erroneous neuron, the value arriving at this neuron is being influenced by this value times this weight, plus this value times this weight, plus this value times this weight. So the error here is possibly being caused by this synapse, this synapse, this synapse, and this synapse, this synapse, and this synapse. In this cartoon example, we would have to go back and make changes to all 6 synapses. That's a big change. In this case, when we have recurrent connections, backpropagation of error often doesn't work too well, because the recurrent connections cause the backpropagation of error to flow to most, if not all, of the neural network, and we make changes all the way, which means that there's a good chance if we're making a lot of changes, we might actually improve the output for this case. But if we're making a lot of changes, we might fix things here, but in the process, break things here, or here, or here. This is like using a sledgehammer on a neural network. If you have a machine that's partially broken, like our neural network here, obviously it makes sense to go in with tweezers as best you can and focus on just where the problem lies. But in complex machines, like neural networks with recurrent connections, if the machine is partly broken, it's often hard to isolate exactly where the problem is. Okay. There are versions of the backpropagation of error algorithm that do work for recurrent neural networks, but that's beyond the focus of this course. What I'm trying to do today in our discussion of artificial neural networks is just sort of give you a sense of what they are, what they're good at, and what they're not so good at. Okay. We're going to, so we have neural networks, and then we can talk about the algorithms that improve those neural networks. I just talked about backpropagation of error, probably the most famous machine learning algorithm for neural networks. Backpropagation is an example of a supervised learning algorithm. What do I mean by supervised? Backpropagation is supervised because the supervisor, which is us in this case, tells the algorithm where the error is. We as the supervisor say there's a problem here, but there is not a problem here. Okay. What happens, however, if we don't actually, and we can do that because we know exactly what values should be arriving at the output. We take the desired values at the output and we compare them against the actual values of the output, and we can then supervise the tuning of these synaptic weights. In semi-supervised learning, which we're going to focus on in this class, we do not exactly know what a particular motor should have been doing at a given point in time to produce forward locomotion in our robot, if that's what we were trying to do. The only thing we can do is supply the current sensor values to our neural network, propagate those sensor values through to the motor level. The motors control the robot, which changes the sensor values of the robot at the next time step, which causes the motors to do something else, which resets the values of the sensors, which causes the motors to do something else in turn, sensor, motor, sensor, motor, sensor, motor. And at the end, we get back just a single number from the physics engine or from the physical robot out in the world about how well it did. If we want a robot that moves as quickly as possible, we get back a floating point value, which is how far the robot traveled from the origin. If this robot moved slowly, I don't know if 6.3 meters is slow or fast, it doesn't really say here, but let's say the robot did slowly, so it's partly broken. Maybe you watch the robot and you notice that it's limping, and you can tell that there's probably a better way for the robot to move. Which synapse connecting which sensor to which motor needs to be changed? It is impossible for us to determine, so we cannot supervise where in the network changes are made to improve the neural network the next time we use it. Okay, so all of the algorithms we're going to see in this course you can think of as semi-supervised learning. We know generally how well this neural network did, but not exactly where it went wrong. Okay, that's the end of our discussion about neural networks. Again, obviously this was a very quick pass over the basic building blocks of neural networks. Any questions about neural networks before we move on to evolutionary algorithms? No? Okay. All right, so we're now going to switch gears and talk about the particular semi-supervised learning we're going to use, a semi-supervised method we're going to use to tune our robots, and those are evolutionary algorithms. What is an evolution? There are hundreds of different kinds of evolutionary algorithms. They all share one thing in common, which is that they are population-based. What do I mean by that? Well, if we look at nature, you can view Darwinian evolution as a form of an algorithm. We have a population of species. Those species have some genetic variation. That genetic variation dictates their anatomy and their behavior. Their anatomy and behavior, depending on their environmental niche, will allow some organisms, unfortunately will cause some organisms not to live long enough to produce offspring or not be able to find a mate or so on. Other individuals in the population, given their anatomy and their behavior, they will be able to successfully mate and produce offspring. And those offspring will be similar to, but not identical to their parents. If we iterate through the Darwinian algorithm, after a long period of time, we end up with a population of individuals that are well adapted to their environment. So going all the way back to the 1950s, 60s, and into the 70s, computer scientists created what then was known as the genetic algorithm. And the genetic algorithm is now one kind of evolutionary algorithm. We're going to use evolutionary algorithm as our umbrella term for all the different kinds of evolutionary algorithms we're going to look at, of which the genetic algorithm is one. The genetic algorithm, like biological evolution, starts with a population of things. In this case, instead of birds, we have data structures. As we'll see, different evolutionary algorithms encode things in different data structures. In this case, we've got a population of vectors, and these vectors or these data structures are encoding candidate solutions to a given problem. We're going to assume that we don't know what the solution to our problem is. That's why we're using an evolutionary algorithm. So we're going to start by creating a population of random solutions, and we'll see some examples of solutions and problems in a moment. We're going to assume that the computer has some way of scoring the quality or the fitness of any one solution. Solutions that have low fitness or low quality, they're poor solutions and they're deleted from the population. The surviving vectors here, the computer makes randomly modified copies of them, and those randomly modified copies replace the data structures that were deleted. In this cartoon example here, you can see that this particular solution survived. We're making a copy of it, and as we go, we're copying over the values, and from time to time we make a slight mistake. What mechanism of biological evolution are we simulating at this point in the genetic algorithm? Why would you ever create a computer algorithm that deliberately makes mistakes during copying? Seems like kind of an odd thing to do. Exactly, mutations, right? So there is power in making modified copies, not identical copies. You'll notice in this cartoon example, while we're copying genetic material from the vector of this parent into this child vector, there's an arrow here representing that we're copying some genetic material from this vector, but into the same vector, we are also copying some genetic material from this other surviving vector, and that's being passed along here as well. So we're actually combining numbers from this vector with values from this vector, and some of those copying events we introduce changes. What evolutionary mechanism are we simulating by combining numbers from two surviving vectors into the child vector? Not quite mitosis. Mitosis is the splitting of cells. It's reproduction, right? This is meiosis. Yeah, you got it right, Hannah. That's right. So we're combining genetic material from two parents into the child vector here. One of the interesting things about evolutionary algorithms is obviously biological evolution is not just meiosis and mutation. There are thousands, if not millions, of various mechanisms going on that allow species to adapt to their environments. All evolutionary algorithms so far only simulate a small subset of all those evolutionary mechanisms. So there's lots of interesting work remaining to be done in this field. Okay, so there's an entire field in computer science known as evolutionary algorithms, and there's a course here at UVM, a sister course called Evolutionary Computation, where you can dig down into these algorithms in much more detail. The field of evolutionary robotics comes about when you take a robot simulator, you take a physics engine, and you wrap an evolutionary algorithm around it. So now the problem is that we would like a robot to perform behavior X. As you're going to see in a moment, the behavior in this video that we were interested in is brachiation. Brachiation is the behavior where you swing from tree limb to tree limb. Primates are very good at this. This particular primate species, Homo sapiens sapiens, we're not very good at it. You can do it for a little while, but for most of us, you get pretty tired pretty quickly. Lots of other primates out there that are excellent at this. For those of you that like animal videos, go Google gibbons and brachiation. Gibbons are the undisputed masters of this behavior in the animal kingdom. Okay, so the problem is we would like a robot to be able to move along a beam. Maybe we want to create a bridge inspecting robot or some other robot that needs to climb along girders to get to a particular point. That's the problem. The solution is going to be a vector of numbers, and these numbers are going to represent the synaptic weights for the neural network that connects this robot's sensors to this robot's motors. So this is the first point in the class where we've brought all these concepts together. We have a robot. We'd like it to brachiate. This robot has a number of sensors. It has a number of motors. We've connected those sensors to motors with some synapses, but we don't know what the weights of those synapses should be. to get the robot to brachiate. So we're going to go looking for those synaptic weights. We cannot use the backpropagation of error because if the robot fails to brachiate, we do not know which motor or which synapse or which neuron did the wrong thing at a given point in time. So instead, we're going to create a population of sets of synaptic weights. We're going to take these synaptic weights, 0.3, 0.4, and so on, 0.7. We're going to plug them into the neural network that controls this robot. We're going to see how well it does. If that robot travels a short distance along the pipe, we delete that vector. If another one of these vectors, if we take the synaptic weights out of there, plug them into the neural network that controls the robot, let the robot attempt to brachiate again, and if that vector allows the robot to move a little bit faster along the pipe, then we keep that vector and we allow it to make randomly modified copies. That's evolutionary robotics. Any questions at this point before we move on? We're going to see this concept over and over again, an evolutionary algorithm evolving sets of synaptic weights for a neural network controller. But I just wanted to pause here to make sure you can see how all these pieces fit together. So far, so good? Okay. Here is the best solution we got in simulation. As you can see from the date on this paper where we reported these results, this is an older experiment. But you can already see we're starting to get some brachiation. It's definitely not as good as gibbon brachiation, but it's pretty good. We then took that particular vector that was the best vector at the end of this evolutionary process, produced the fastest motion of this robot. We took those set of synaptic weights and we programmed them into the microprocessor that was controlling a physical version of the robot. So this physical robot is being controlled by exactly the same neural network that its virtual counterpart was. And this is what we got. Okay, so not bad. If you look carefully, I don't know if I can play, there you go, I can play both at the same time. These behaviors are different. They're not identical, but they're pretty close. And so this, in this case, the robot crossed the reality gap, or the evolved neural network crossed the reality gap. This is a hard thing to do, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the reality gap in about a month's time. There's something else you can notice that's interesting about the behavior of both the simulated robot and the physical behavior. There's a few things. What do you notice about the behavior? Are there some things that are kind of surprising or drew your attention? This robot obviously doesn't look anything like a primate, but it's sort of got the right idea. You'll notice, given that this was 2002 technology, we had to simulate these heavy battery packs, which are at the bottom of the robot. The modified robot begins its motion by kicking its quote-unquote leg. Why? The physical robot swings more violently. Yeah, absolutely. You'll notice that it's actually a metal wire that it's moving along, not a stiff beam, so it's sort of bouncing and swinging a little bit more. A lot of differences between reality and simulation here. Why did the evolutionary algorithm evolve a neural network controller that causes the robot to kick its leg to get moving? Momentum. You'll remember when we talked about embodied cognition last week, we as bipedal walkers, our evolution has exploited our bodies to allow us to move very energy efficiently. Depending on what physical shape you're in, you can travel, I forget how many miles it is, but you can travel 5 or 10 or 15 miles on half a Big Mac, which is, trust me, an extremely energy efficient transformation of chemical energy into movement, locomotion. We do so by exploiting the physical interaction of our body with the environment. Descartes tried to convince us that the body is an obstruction, right? It's a temporary thing to get rid of. It's a bad thing, or it's a distraction. The body, for us and for brachiating creatures like gibbons and this robot, evolution can exploit the physics of the body to make motion more efficient. You can notice that this robot is actually swinging in such a way that its heavy battery pack, which might have been a drag or an obstruction or a problem, has turned it into an advantage. So if you go back and review our notes on embodied cognition, the brachiator that you see here is a great example of how embodiment can be helpful in robotics rather than an obstruction. Okay, so we're now going to focus directly on evolutionary algorithms, and we're going to explore a couple of them. As I mentioned, there's hundreds of flavors of evolutionary algorithms. We're going to just focus on a couple. And in order to understand them and weigh the pros and cons of these different algorithms, we're going to use a particular mathematical metaphor known as the fitness landscape. This was introduced by the evolutionary biologist Sewell Wright back in the 1930s. The fitness landscape helps you to think more clearly about biological evolution, and as we'll see, it also helps us to think more clearly about evolutionary algorithms as well. This landscape is meant to be metaphorical. It's mathematical. It doesn't exist in reality. Let's imagine that we think about the genotype of a given species or the genotype of a robot for our purposes. A genotype is always made up of a number of genes. And the fitness landscape, the dimension of the fitness landscape is going to exist in one additional dimension beyond the number of genes. So if we're thinking about a genotype that has n genes, the fitness landscape is going to have n plus 1 dimensions. What's that plus 1? That plus 1 is going to represent the fitness, which we're going to assume is something we can boil down to a number. A fitness produced by the organism or robot that is described by these n genes. Yeah. So imagine we have an organism or a robot that has just 2 genes. What's a gene in our case? At the moment, we've been looking at vectors of numbers. You can think of each element in the vector or each number in the vector as a single gene. Remember our Bratenberg vehicle, which had just 2 edges, either contralateral connections or ipsilateral connections. If you think about a Bratenberg vehicle and you think about evolving the 2 weights for those 2 synapses, that genotype or that vector has just 2 numbers for the 2 weights of those 2 synapses. If we were going to evolve such a Bratenberg vehicle, you can think about gene 1 as one axis in this fitness landscape, gene 2 as the second horizontal axis, and the third axis, the plus 1, is the fitness of a given neural network for that Bratenberg vehicle. So if we just think about the 2 horizontal axes here, gene 1 and gene 2, you can imagine all possible vectors that encode floating point values for those two values. So think about all possible 2-element long vectors. If we take a given vector with a given pair of floating point values, we can treat those 2 floating point values as position in horizontal space here in these two along these two axes. If we go to that horizontal position, we take those 2 weights, we label the synapses in the Bratenberg vehicle, we let the Bratenberg vehicle do its thing, and we measure its fitness. Let's say we wanted that Bratenberg vehicle to attack light bulbs. we measure how good a job it does at turning towards and accelerating towards the light. If it does a good job, we give it a positive fitness value. If it does a poor job, if it turns around and runs away from the light, we give it a negative value. We can imagine moving to different points horizontally in this space, representing different Bradenberg vehicles, different settings of the two synapses. And the height at that point represents how good or how bad the robot did at phototaxis. Make sense? If we take the same Bradenberg vehicle, the same two synapses, but we change the fitness function, we change what we want the robot to do, let's assume we change it to photophobia. We want the robot to run away from the light. What happens to the fitness landscape here? Let's imagine that this is the fitness landscape corresponding to phototaxis, turning and moving towards the light. Phototaxis. What happens if we change the fitness function to photophobia? How does this fitness landscape change? How does the surface of this fitness landscape change? We're going to now, it inverts exactly. Whatever is tall in the landscape becomes deep, and whatever is deep becomes tall. The peaks would be inverted, exactly. So you can start to see how we're now starting to think about an abstract space. We're thinking about all possible Bradenberg vehicles and how well or poorly they do against a given behavior we want them to do. And you can think about the surface of this fitness landscape. Okay, so along the way, we're starting to introduce some terms from evolutionary biology. The first one here is genotype or genome. I'll use those synonymously throughout the course. For our purposes, a genotype or genome is just meant to represent the data structure that houses all the values of our robot. They encode the things that we want to try and determine about our robot. If I talk about genes, a gene is usually going to be a number, a synaptic weight, or the length of a leg. We're going to see how the evolutionary algorithm can alter body, not just brain. We're also going to talk not just about genotype, but phenotype. Phenotype in evolutionary biology refers to the physical aspects of the animal or the organism. So everything to do with the anatomy and everything to do with behavior. So phenotype equals anatomy plus behavior. Another way of putting this is the phenotype is the system produced by the genotype, and the genotype is obviously the storage mechanism for the genetic information. So far, so good? Okay, so we just looked at an example where we have two genes, which gives us a three-dimensional fitness landscape. We looked at, here's a hypothetical example. Imagine we have a Bradenberg vehicle that has just one wire. Actually, vehicle one has just one wire. The fitness landscape exists in two dimensions, and you get something that looks like this. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to use this super cartoony version of a fitness landscape, and we're going to think about some different evolutionary algorithms. And in order to understand those algorithms, we're going to think about them, on just a very, very simple fitness landscape where we've got just one gene and fitness is height, as always. Okay. We're going to start with a very, very simple algorithm called the hill climber. And I think in assignment 5, you're going to code up a hill climber. The hill climber is technically not an evolutionary algorithm because it is not population-based. As I mentioned before, all evolutionary algorithms assume that at any given time we have a population of solutions to our problem. A hill climber has a population, if you like, of just one. So in a hill climber, we start by initializing the population, which is just one, by creating a random vector here. I'm going to call this the parent for now. Now that we've initialized the population, we move on to step 2 of all evolutionary algorithms, which is to score the solution. So let's imagine that this particular parent, and I recognize that I've written it out as with multiple genes here, and then over here we're going to assume that we have just one gene. Let's assume that this parent lands at this particular point in the horizontal surface of the landscape. We compute the fitness, how well we take the phenotype of this solution, which could be a Bratenberg vehicle, and we measure how well it does at the task. And let's imagine this parent genome gets this fitness value, kind of a low value. So far, so good? Okay. Now we're going to perform selection, which is we're going to select which individuals are allowed to produce offspring and get rid of the ones, delete the ones that don't produce offspring. In this case, obviously, there's only one individual, so we select this individual. We vary it by making a copy of it and introducing some randomly modified copy. We modify some values as we go randomly. You'll see the 7 here has become a 0.8. So we now have a child vector, and as you can see, this child vector is similar to, but not identical to, the parent vector. Because the gene values are different, that means that this child vector is going to exist at a different horizontal position in the fitness landscape. Again, I'm simplifying things over here so I can draw it. If we have multiple genes here, we would have a high dimensional fitness landscape, but I'm just simplifying things so we can draw it. Let's imagine if we take this set of synaptic weights, drop it into our robot, that robot now does worse than the parent robot did. And so the child vector accrues a fitness value that's lower than the fitness value of its parent. So the hill climber, in moving from the parent to the child, has moved downhill, down the fitness landscape. We now have two individuals. We varied the parent by creating the child. We've gone back to step 2. We've assigned a fitness to the child. We now need to select from among these 2 individuals which one survives to produce an offspring. Which of these 2 individuals do you think survives? The parent or the child? The parent, right? The parent has higher fitness than the child. So in this simple algorithm, selection is pretty easy. At every given point, we have a parent and child. At the beginning, we only had one parent, but once we start iterating through this process, we have a parent and child, and we look to see which one did better. If the parent did better, we delete the child, and we allow the parent to produce another offspring. If the child did better than the parent, which meant the child would have been higher in the fitness landscape than the parent, we throw away the parent, keep the child. We rename the child parent, and now the new parent is able to produce an offspring, and we continue this process. If you think about this fitness landscape, we throw away this child, we go back to P, P produces another C, and let's imagine that this C happens to land up here. This C is higher than P, so P is deleted, we keep C. C matures into a parent, it's the new P. It's allowed to produce an offspring. Eventually, one of its offspring does better than it's deleted, and you can see that this hill climber will gradually climb this hill. If we get to the top of this hill and we have a P up here, all of its C's are going to be lower than the parent, which is sitting on the top of this hill, and we're stuck. The main advantage of the hill climber is it's extremely simple. You could probably, if you're comfortable with Python, you could probably write this up in about 12 lines of code. It's not that difficult. But it has a disadvantage, which it's a very weak learner, or it's a weak evolver, or it's a weak optimizer. What do I mean by weak versus strong? It means that it is very easy for this algorithm to get stuck on hills. It never discovers this higher mountain which contains much better solutions than either of these 2 hills. Okay, so that's the hill climber. How might we improve the hill climber? How might we introduce some complexity into this algorithm to make it slightly stronger, less likely to get stuck on whatever hill it lands on. Any ideas? Feel free to unmute yourself and offer an idea if you have one. We could add mutations randomly. So mutations are currently being added randomly. Matt says we could increase variation. So the amount that we vary the child when it's produced from the parent, we could increase that variation. What would that mean in terms of the fitness landscape? The cartoon example here, I've been describing the C's as falling kind of close to the parent. If we increase variation, meaning that this vector has a greater Euclidean distance from the parent vector, if you think about that in terms of the fitness landscape, that means that C is going to fall further away horizontally from the parent. It may fall over here, which means it actually does worse than the parent, or maybe it falls over here, which means it does better than the parent. By increasing variation, that doesn't necessarily mean that we make an evolutionary algorithm better. We might introduce the potential that it does. We'll come back to increasing variation in a moment. The first thing you can do is, instead of dropping just one P on one hill and hoping that you've landed on this slope of the highest hill in the fitness landscape, we can sprinkle a number of parents, which is what gives us the unimaginatively named parallel hill climber. So now the parallel hill climber is definitely a type of evolutionary algorithm, because now we do have a population. We start by creating a population of random parental vectors. Each vector has random values in it. These vectors are different from one another. We score each of these parents, so we determine the heights of the parents. In this case, I've just got two parents. You can see that P1 got slightly more fitness than P2. Each parent creates a randomly modified copy of itself, producing, in our case, two children. We can see that over here, C1 is less fit than P1, which means C1 will be deleted. Over here, C2 is more fit than P2, so P2 is deleted and C2 survives and becomes the new P2. So we sprinkle a whole bunch of points in our fitness landscape and they all start locally climbing their slope. Are we likely to do better than the hill climber? Assuming both algorithms have more or less the same amount of variation. Hopefully yes, right? If we sprinkle enough points. The question is, how many points are enough? In our case, in this cartoon here, we're assuming that we can see the fitness landscape, which is never true, because if we could see the fitness landscape, we're done. We've solved the problem. We know that this set of synaptic weights will cause the Bradenberg vehicle to do the best job of phototaxis it can possibly do. The best way to think about the fitness landscape as a landscape that is completely shrouded in fog. You have a helicopter and you can travel over the fog bank, but you can't see the fitness landscape, and you can drop human mountaineers with parachutes down onto the surface, which is P1 and P2. You can drop them at different places on the landscape. And when you drop those mountaineers, you can give them instructions about how they should behave. How should they create new mountaineers? How should those mountaineers try and climb the slopes and so on? Imagine that your mountaineers have smartphones and they can text back to headquarters and indicate their height, where they are, how high they've managed to reach. Even if we did that, we would not be able to guarantee, they cannot tell us that they're at the highest point because we cannot see the fitness landscape. At any given time, we only know the elevations or the heights of all of the potential solutions in our population. How do we increase the chances that as this algorithm proceeds, we will our solutions will continue to achieve higher and higher fitness values. It is a very difficult problem and it remains unsolved today. We only have 1 minute left, so I think instead of starting in on the genetic algorithm, which is yet an improvement on the parallel hill climber, we'll pause here for today. You have a quiz due tonight by 11:59 p.m. You're now working on assignment 3, where you'll be adding sensors to your robot. Wish you all a good rest of your day, and see you back here Thursday morning. Thanks very much.